Now I request the tech team to play the recorded interview of Dr. Ashok Vaidya.
I'm Dr. Vidita Vaidya, a professor at the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, and it is my honor and privilege today to interview Dr. Ashok Vaidya, MD PhD, an alumnus of St. GS Medical College. I'm conducting this interview on behalf of the ML Kothari Chair at the GS Medical College. So let me dive straight in. You were the batch of 1954 that joined MBBS at St. GS Medical, am I right?
Yeah, 1954 was the really a wonderful year to join GS Medical College.
So let me ask you, how did you find yourself drawn to the medical profession, or was it that it chose you instead?
Well, I belong to four generations of medicine, and as a consequence, it was almost like a predestined that my great grandfather was a great Vaidya, grandfather was a modern allopath, father practiced integrated practice, and obviously from childhood I felt that I will become a doctor, and that too for the purpose of not only medical practice but to advance the scientific knowledge in medicine to serve humanity.
Do you remember how old you were when you first came to GS Medical College, and what was your first impression of GS Medical College in KM Hospital?
I was just 17 years old, and it was first time I was getting separated family, living all by myself. But the very ambience of GS Medical College was very welcoming. And as a consequence, I did not feel homesickness. And second thing, that my close school friends, Dr. Vatuk Gandhi and Professor Manu Kothari, were my classmates. And Manu and myself stayed in the hostel together, so it really took away that feeling of being away from home.
Can I ask you, do you remember anything about the admissions process, and was St. GS Medical College always your first choice, or did you have some other options that you were thinking about?
It's a wonderful question. I wanted to go to Grad Medical College because I had heard a lot about Grad Medical College and relatively less about Gordon Das Sundardas Medical College. But at that time, government stopped all the admissions of Gujarat students for medical college to restricted to Gujarat medical colleges only. And but GS had a unique admission policy. They took the top 5 of several universities without, and they gave them priority without even considering their score. The top 5 were taken. But I still felt, so I went to Dr. Jivraj Mehta, who was finance minister of Maharashtra government at that time, to try to see whether I can get a Grand Medical. He persuaded me, saying that GS Medical is a wonderful college and it's a better college than Grand Medical. I argued that you are telling because you were the dean of that medical college. But he convinced me that the scholastic atmosphere of GS was most suited for my foundation, robust foundation medical studies.
Do you remember any question you were asked in the middle of that interview? Is there anything that is tickling your memory box that you remember from that day?
It's very interesting that the dean took interview of every medical student, and he had some unique questions to ask. And one of the questions he asked was very interesting. What are your hobbies, Mr. Vaidya? And in my youthful bravado, I told him that my hobbies extend from Holy Gita to Hollywood. And he gave me a wonderful smile. And I think that at that moment I cherished that GS would allow me my broad interest to grow.
That's wonderful. Do you have recollections of specific faculty members from that time who may have influenced you and really left strong memories in your mind from that phase of your education?
For the basic sciences, I had some wonderful teachers. And I particularly remember Professor C.K. Deshpande from pathology, who later became the dean. And he was such a wonderful teacher that he impressed me that how pathophysiology of a disease is so vital to understand. And our relationship lasted long. He developed a special fondness for me, and we had a wonderful relationship for a lifetime. And in the Department of Pharmacology, Professor Roger Lewis from abroad was my professor, WHO professor. But halfway he left, and Professor Yukesh came from Nair Medical College, and being MD in medicine, his clinical pharmacology predilection was wonderful. And as a consequence, I really had wonderful teachers in pharmacology, Professor Gaitonde, Professor Satoskar, and I developed lifelong interest in pharmacology and clinical pharmacology.
You know, as a neuropsychopharmacologist myself, I would love you to tell me about Dr. Rustam Jal Vakil, who is perhaps one of the luminaries in this space in our country. Did he teach you? Were you in a classroom when he was teaching?
Yeah, he was my teacher on the clinical side, and I still remember his tutorials in angina pectoris and coronary heart disease. And I was so impressed by his I would say, refined culture. He was a Lasker Award winner, which is equivalent to the Nobel Prize in USA. And he impressed me with his work on Sarpaganda, Rovalpia. And that, in a way, infected me for understanding the mechanisms of medicinal phytochemicals in terms of molecular pharmacology, in terms of experimental pharmacology. And later on, I was responsible for building an institute of Dr. Rustam Jal Vakil Institute of Cardiology at KEM, along with Professor K.G. Nair. That was really an opportunity.
So, you know, those of us who have not gone to medical school dread the idea of the dissection hall. Can you tell us about some of your experiences? Do you have any specific recollections of being in the dissection hall at GS Medical? What was that like?
A wonderful question. My first dissection was axilla of a young lady who was burnt, and her face was turned towards us in her rhizus almost. And when we dissected the axilla, we found the axillary artery to be abnormal. And it was a novel finding at that time. So we went to our demonstrator and showed him, we have found, Professor Dr. Koticha and myself, that we have found this abnormal branching of axillary artery. He just shrugged it off, and all our enthusiasm was not responded to. I learned the first lesson. Sometimes your teachers may not be the best ones to encourage discoveries and new findings.
So, you know, they say that in an institution, if there is a cathedral or a temple, the temple of an academic institution is its library. What was your experience like in the GS Medical Library? Can you tell me a little bit about it?
Library was like my second home. Hostels, wards, lectures and library. That was the life. And GS Medical had a really extremely rich library. And probably I was one of the few who went to the postgraduate library also. Because in those days, undergraduates did not go to postgraduate library. And sometimes the postgraduate looked at me a bit quizzically, what are you doing here? But I lived through Lancet, I lived through British Medical Journal, Nature, and I was surprised that why we were deprived of these in undergraduate library. And one of the things I remember very early was the discovery of serotonin and how it was covered. And Now you know that my lifelong interest serotonin, my first paper in New England Journal of Medicine was on serotonin and hypothermia. And now I'm working with you on serotonin in terms of the molecular mechanisms at receptor level in the neurons. And that's really amazing journey from those library days.
You know, such things are addictive in that they catch the imagination of generations, because who would have imagined that as your child playing in your lap or sitting in your library at Sibagaigi that I would have picked up that fascination that you have with serotonin and continue that journey. So that is indeed my privilege and honor to do that. I know that just like the library is such a critical component of an academic institution, for a medical institution, the greatest learning space is right by the bedside with your patients. Can you tell us about some patients or experiences you had that have stayed with you over the decades, which came in your early years of your medical education?
I will illustrate one singular example. I had a patient of Hodgkin's lymphoma who had severe anemia, marked spleen and hepatomegaly, and enlargement of lymph nodes. We had to give him multiple transfusions for anemia, and I was surprised to see that as 2 or 3 transfusions went, his tumor melted, almost, that is splenomegaly, hepatomegaly regressed, his lymph nodes almost disappeared. This made such an impact on my mind, and later on in my life I always focused on what molecules exist in biological fluids which can regress tumor. And that interest is continuing even now with my PhD students and also nationally and internationally.
Yeah, that is an understanding of how humoral factors can shape sometimes solid tumors and liquid tumors as well, and that there is much that we can learn from biology in this regard. Amongst all the learning experiences you had at, say, at GS Medical, is there one that you carry with you till date that changed the way you think about learning and your experience of learning itself?
It's a very interesting question, because up to almost first MBBS I was competing always for the rank. I used to state first, second, like that. From first MBBS I decided to study for myself. And I understood this, that ultimately your lifelong love for learning, that can only emerge if you take up your own education in your hands. And my thesis for MD was on Prabhu Sanhita. This was the first thesis probably in entire India on history of medicine, and that too of a Prabhu Sanhita, a manuscript which contained Ayurvedic maxims. And this was promptly rejected by the examiners. That made me determine that sometimes your original efforts may be completely thwarted, but you should never take it to heart and you must continue. And as a consequence, I dedicated my life to Indian knowledge systems, reliable ancient insights and modern discoveries. And next month I am fortunate to be given D.Litt by this University at Bangalore for contributing to ancient systems of knowledge, Indian systems of knowledge and clinical pharmacology.
As a clinical pharmacologist who has such a deep interest in Indian knowledge systems, how did you learn to navigate the fine balance between a deep reverence and respect for the empirical and experiential knowledge of Indian knowledge systems, and at the same time, the importance of a rigorous examination of the veracity of the observations made by Indian knowledge systems? How do you learn and manage this fine balance? Because I think it's a vital lesson for those in India who are now going to explore the knowledge base that comes from Indian traditional knowledge.
It is indeed a very difficult and complex question that you have asked. In my view, A reverence, genuine reverence permits questions and never disallows questions. Our entire tradition of Upanishad is catechism. It's essentially question answers. And if you really respect your rishis, you can question them. I think that the current, what I would say, fanatic recall of that we had all the discoveries done, we had all the science done, and it is initially document, then you do exploratory good studies with robust markers, and then also laboratory studies to understand the mechanism. I think that that path is the right path of reverence and critical evaluations.
Let me ask you a question to go back to some lighter memories from your years at GS Medical. Can you tell us a little bit about your friendships? Did you play any pranks? Was there something that you did that got you into trouble at that time? Can you go back to some lighter memories of that period?
Well, I was usually a very well-behaved, well-disciplined boy. But as I stayed in hostel, I learned that I have to develop my own resistance, my own mechanisms to protect myself. And partly I joined occasionally a mild ragging gang for the new medical students. I regret that. It was not bad, but it was like conducting a medical examination before you go for interview. And at the same time, what was most wonderful was that we had a small group, like Dr. Jain Doshi, Dr. Koticha, Dr. Ramesh Shah, Dr. Lalit Shah, and several other, Dr. Fosdar. And we used to meet every week in the garden of the medical college. And we used to discuss spiritual matters, used to discuss socio-ethical issues. And I think that we were looked down upon by the large crowd of medical students, and we were subject of a cartoon. And in this cartoon, it was shown that Manu Kothari was smelling the rose in the hair of Raksha Koticha, who was also one of our Jankhana members. Ramesh Shah was stating with his gown, "Forget spirituality, let us discuss the role of spirituality in surgery." This cartoon appeared on our wallpaper, and I have preserved that cartoon for lifetime.
What about hostel life? What was the most horrible food you had to suffer through in the hostel, and what was the one day that you used to all be excited because something functionally edible was being provided? What was the worst thing you ate and what was the best thing you ate?
Hostel mess were truly in a mess. And we had to have separate messes because veg and non-veg never mixed. So there was a Gujarati club, there was an Aryan club, there was another cosmopolitan club. And these clubs gave different menus. And I always found it very funny that we all study together but we can't eat together. And I tried to democratize this mess, and I said that the students will run the mess. And I became once the secretary, so I had to go to Baikala to buy fresh vegetables. We always waited for Sunday because there was a feast on Sunday.
You know, each college has its popular student hangout where people like to go. For those of us as Xavier's, it used to be, right round the corner. We had a bunch of places we used to go to. At GS Medical, what were the popular student hangouts at your time? And do you know if any of them are still around? Have you ever gone back and revisited?
Well, immediately next to our college and hospital, we hardly close by restaurant. So we had to go to Parel TT for a Madras cafe. And that was the only place at that time which we used to frequent as medical students. Most of the time we had to either to go to Fort area or to Chopati or to Dadar. And particularly Dadar circle was a very popular place for my Maharashtrian friends because they would love to look at beautiful Maharashtrian girls. And this occasion was for them a kind of a relief.
Okay, let's go from the ridiculous now potentially to the sublime or potentially the torturous. Do you have any memories of examination hall experiences which were in the zone of torture, where you would not have, I mean, bad memories that are still stuck with what you went through in the examination hall?
Well, I never liked examination, basically, because I felt examinations are unnecessary if you have studied throughout the year very well, and you have been also looked at very well every year at your progress during the year. So I do remember my MD examination, and Professor Nathubai D. Patel, physician to Vallabhbhai Patel, he was my examiner. So when he came to the case examination, he asked me, so you are the boy who has written Ahar Shuddho Sattva Shuddhi? And this was the essay I wrote on sophisticated diet and disease. But the examiner remembering it and bringing it out was a great reward. But during the Viva, I was at a distance and examining a slide. One examiner was not keen to pass me at all. And Nathubai got angry and shouted at him, what have you got against this boy? He has done wonderfully well in theory. He has done so well in my long case. Why do you disagree with me? And that again sustained my faith that examinations can be properly conducted too.
As an alumnus of, say, GS Medical, and it's now been 70 years since you entered that wonderful institution, what has your continued association with GS Medical and KEM Hospital been after you finished? You did both your MBBS and your MD from GS Medical. Over the years and decades, have you continued to retain an association with your alma mater? And if so, then how?
Yeah, it's a very profound question. When I went to Yale University as a Merck International Fellow in Clinical Pharmacology, the Dean and Professor both had promised that on your return you will be absorbed in the academia. But when I wanted to return, they said there is no job at all of that kind of clinical pharmacology. But fortunately, I could not join that, but fortunately, because I joined SIBA Research Center, we had a SIBA ward at KIHS Hospital. And we built one of the most reputable clinical pharmaceutical unit in the country and in Asia. And subsequently, I continued my association very closely. And I feel that my having started the past Cosmic Society of USA with KG Nair was one such contribution. And later on in suggesting Professor Manu Kothari chair is something which I feel has continued my association, and my colleagues and students, Professor Nilima Kshirsagar, Dr. Urmila, Dr. Thatte, they have continued close relationships in research also.
I think Dr. Nitya Gopte is still at KEM.
Nitya is still at KEM in charge of clinical pharmacology, and the department is doing very well.
That's wonderful when legacies carry on a culture and transmit that to the next generation, because that is something that is profound and powerful, and institutions outlive the walls of the institution if they create legacies that get carried by alumni and mentees, not just to that institution but across the world as well. Can I ask, if you had the chance now to go back and redo something at GS Medical? It's 70 years since you went there as a student. Some young person is entering it in 2024, I'm sure. If you had a chance to change medical education for them and shape it in a way you think that might be valuable for the next generation of India's doctors, what would be 3 of the big changes you would bring about?
The first change I would love to do is that not to expose the students only to anatomy and physiology right away. because the dissection of the body and the physiological mechanisms give an understanding that human being is like a machine, and mechanistic understanding of health and disease suffices. So I would love to have earlier contact with patients so that they can realize that patient's disease is not patient's illness. Patient's illness has to be handled by healing, and those healing qualities of a physician can be developed earlier. That is one change. Second change, I would love to eliminate examination because I hated them. And I would say there should be a continuous evaluation, and very few should be failing at any time because the brightest ones have been admitted to the medical college. And third, last thing is that they should have exchanges with Indian systems of knowledge, Indian systems of healing, and there should be a kind of dialogue amongst the systems of India.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ashok Vaidya, also my father. So it's a rare privilege that you get to interview your father at the same time as also interviewing one of India's leading clinical pharmacologists, an MD PhD, in an era in which MD and PhDs were, combined MD PhDs were indeed rare. Both he and Dr. Rama Vaidya, also a GS Medical College alum, are the unusual MD PhDs of that generation. And I'm the one that I call the least educated in the family. I only have a PhD, managed to escape on the MD front. But perhaps this is an indication to the community that we now need to grow a cadre of MD PhDs who can have a lifelong love as clinician scientists with a deep exploration of the fundamental basis of biomedical disorders. Would you like to have some
I would like
message?
to thank Professor Sunil Pandya, whom I could insist to take up the chair of Manu Kothari, my close friend, and Dr. Lopa Mehta, the Dean of KEM, and several professors who have played immense role, and students particularly. They have taken up humanities and ethics in their stride, and I feel very proud that in memory of my close friend, this has happened. And I thank for this opportunity to share some of my thoughts and experiences with you.